I picked up this vintage Art Deco piece from my local restore. It was in fairly good condition, but there were these large gouges in the top of each of the drawers. Some were deeper than others, and I'm not quite sure what happened here. Maybe the drawer wasn't sliding right, so someone just gouged it out. Anyways, I also had quite a bit of scratches on the top and veneer chipping in multiple places, which is okay. I'm going to replace that and fill that. And overall, I really like the shape, and I thought for $150, I could do something nice with this. And if we haven't met yet, my name is Candace, and I like to find vintage furniture to refinish. So I'm starting off strong with my carbide scraper. This finish was fairly old and came off fairly easily, so that was really great. And a big reason why I chose the scraper, because it just peeled right off. And sometimes I forget, but it is important to wear a mask during this process because the dust from the scraper will end up in and around your face. And I got this RZ mask, which I really like. It's a lot more comfortable, and it's still taking me a minute to figure out how to put it on, but there we go. The wood underneath is looking like teak to me. And you can see that there are some stains, water stains, which I'm going to try to remove. The veneer is fairly thin, so I think this is the best route, is to start with the scraper and then lightly sand with my sander. I like to start by scraping in the center of the piece and avoiding the edges. And then I come back and get the edges done all at once. I find that often these older pieces have a little bit of a bow to them, and so it's just easier to get at those edges with smaller strokes of your carbide scraper. And I don't want to just sand down the edges because I know the veneer on this piece is super thin and I wouldn't want to break through it. The one downside of using the scraper as opposed to my sander and dust extractor is that you end up with more dust in the air, which I'm starting to find Sometimes it's better to just use the sander, but sometimes you can't do that also. So it really depends on the project. I recently refinished a piece that someone else had already refinished a few years ago. And it was interesting to see how much tougher the top coat was. And I actually couldn't use my scraper because it had a few layers of polyurethane, and the scraper just was really hard to use, and it was just not getting that top coat off. So it's really interesting to me because uh, these older pieces often don't have the same level of varnish or top coat protection, and they still held up pretty well, like this one. I'm really liking the color of the veneer, and I'm thinking I'm going to try Danish oil on this piece. I think it'll just really add a nice natural color to the wood. And this would be my first time using Danish oil, but I picked some up the other day to use on a cutting board, and I had some left over, so I was thinking I'd try it on this piece. As you can see, even just a light sanding is taking off this thin varnish. I always find these corners and edges tough to get at, so I don't usually use my sanding block for that. I'll just use sandpaper and a little patience. You want to be careful when you're sanding wood detail like this because often it's can be really easy to misshapen or change the rounder features of the wood, like in this design. So I just take my time with it. I was going to take the legs off before sanding them, but this seemed to work perfectly fine. That was the medium grit, so now I'm going to have to go back in with the fine grit. I always find it easier to clean as I go, because once I didn't when I was super excited to finish a piece, and then I ended up with this huge mess afterwards, which I really didn't want to clean, but it has to be done. So this is just easier. And no, I'm not super fast. It's on high speed so that you can see this done in less time. And now it's time to use my orbital sander. I'm going to start with 120 grit because the veneer is very thin on this piece. And I'm going to go in the direction of the grain of the wood, putting just a little bit of pressure. I can already see a lot of those water stains coming out with the sander, which is great. And now I'm using my sanding block with a fine grit sandpaper to get a really smooth surface and smooth out any blotches or unevenness in the wood. I'll use a clean, wet rag to clean up any dust, and this is going to give me a good picture of what the piece would look like if I just go ahead and use the Danish oil as I planned without any stain or varnish. And of course, I've got to fix this chipped veneer. Starting off by using an X-Acto knife to clean up the edges and get a straight line. I've only repaired veneer one other time, so I'm still fairly new to this. And I'm using a paper to make a trace of the shape, which I'm then going to cut out of my veneer. I had walnut veneer on hand, so we're going to try our best to match this. Taping down the edges so it doesn't move around while I'm doing my cuts. And there's a little bit of a deeper gouge, so I'm using an epoxy 2-part filler and adding just a little bit of gel stain to get it into a darker color. We're just gonna put a little bit in that crack and then let it dry completely. And unfortunately, these gouges were too deep to not use anything other than epoxy, so I'm going to use the epoxy to make sure it holds up, and we'll try to just blend that in with the rest of the piece. I used a little bit of glue and I clamped it overnight. For this, I just used Gorilla Glue because it's clear and it dries much faster than wood glue. But you can also use contact cement or wood glue. And now I'm filling in the edges with a wood filler. That little piece of veneer on the edge just wasn't going to hold. I was worried it was going to chip off and potentially pull the whole rest of it with it. So I removed it and put a wood filler in the crack. This is the Danish oil I picked up, and I'm using a clean rag to apply an even coat. Working with Danish oil is quite different than working with stain or varnishes. You can really buff it into the wood, and actually the more you buff, the better it looks. So I'm applying an even coat, and then I'm going to let this sit for 20 minutes, remove any excess. The thing I like about the Danish oil is the smell is fairly neutral. I also like how the Danish oil penetrates into the wood, and so it really gives it this richness and color. The one downside of using Danish oil is that you have to be careful when you discard your used cloths because they have a risk of combustion, and you have to either let them air dry out on a metal surface before you can dispose of them, or you can do what I did, and I cleaned an old paint can and then put them in there with some water. But eventually I have to find a place to dispose of them because they can just randomly combust, which isn't great. Overall, I found the Danish oil was super easy to apply and looked really great. So I'll definitely be using this again on future furniture pieces. Now it's time to try to blend in this veneer. I'm using General Finishes in the color Candlelight. This is a oil-based gel stain, and I'm just lightly brushing it on in strokes within the direction of the grain of the wood. Now that I've got an even coat, I'm going to wipe away some excess. Using the same general finishes in Candlelight. And I'm going to paint it on over the epoxy. Now that I've let the wood cure, I'm going to buff in as much as I can. Really like the glow and the color. It's very vibrant. It just looks really great. So now I'm going to put a matte finish polyurethane top coat on the top of the dresser to protect it as this gets the most use. I'll apply 2 coats of this, and I'm applying it in strokes within the direction of the wood grain. And that's it. Here it is, all finished. If you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. It really helps my channel. Thanks for watching. See you next time.